The lives of 31 former pupils at King Edward VI School in Stratford-upon-Avon, who lost their lives in the First World War, will once again be commemorated in a rededication at the school's Memorial Library building in May. In the months running up to that tribute, the school has launched an appeal this week to trace surviving relatives of 3 sets of brothers who were killed fighting for king and country.
Well, what we'd like to do is to gather together as many representatives to commemorate the event 100 years ago, so that, for example, local historians, local associations, ex-soldiers, people of that type have been invited. The Vicar of Holy Trinity has agreed to come, so that what we'd like to do is to actually repeat to a large extent the event that happened 100 years ago. So the same hymn, O Valiant Heart, will be sung. I've asked the school choir and the school orchestra to play, all being well. The whole school will be assembled in the quad in the afternoon. And also 1 or 2 of the relations that we know have association with the boys will be able to come. But what I'd like you to do, the Herald to do, is to possibly make contact or make the event more publicly aware, so that out there perhaps there are relations who could make contact with us and give us the information, and would be invited obviously to come. So the event will mirror to some extent what happened 100 years ago.
It could obviously be an emotional moment. Okay, it's 100 years on, but the memories never fade for the bravery for pupils from this school and other schools up and down the country. What will it mean to you and the current pupils and students at Kes?
Well, personally for me, it'll be the realization of something, because I taught history here. I taught the First World War. I'm old enough to remember boys who fought in the Second World War, and we had 52 boys that were lost. So I knew their families, so therefore that resonates for that. And when I first began to teach, I also knew the survivors of the First World War, long since gone, because when I started teaching in 1966, there were still, 50 years later, there were still old boys who fought in the trenches. So from a personal viewpoint, it'll resonate. But from the school itself, I think it's the association and this building, which means a great deal, which was built as a commemoration, so that boys of successive generations would never forget, and so that present day boys who all come in here occasionally, but they know that the building exists and they know the significance of this. So yes, it'll be an emotional day, probably for them, and it'll be a particularly emotional day for those old enough to remember people who were lost in the Second World War and relations of those who were lost in the First.
And we have their names, which will live on forever, which are remembered in the commemorative plaque behind you.
Yes.
What plans are there for this particular beautiful piece of work?
Well, it's going to be cleaned. It was bought for by the historian G.M. Trevelyan, as the whole building was actually financed to some extent by him and the governors at the time, for the ridiculously small amount of £700. But £700 in 1923 was a considerable amount of money. And the oak timber came from the same forest as the old medieval buildings that are over there. And there was Evesham stone for the plinth. So it's all related to the area. And in 100 years ago, the school, well, 1914, the school was very small. I mean, it's relatively small now, but it was very small then. There were just 150, 160 boys in the school. So the loss of 32 was significant. In 1939, there were just 280 boys in the school, and the loss of 52 of them was considerable. A large proportion of them were in the RAF, so that their loss was quite significant. So the Memorial Library means a great deal to the school, and although we're a very busy school and very active, and the time is spent by the boys, obviously doing many things, they're aware of this building, and I hope that what's important on this day is that it'll focus their attention, even just briefly, on the fact that this is here, and it means so much to them, because it has a meaning for those boys that came before them and played in the same playground as they, and sat in the same rooms as they sat in today.
Thank you, Richard Pearson.
Pleasure.